I'll wing it. I'm having to restart my computer. Technology is always fun. I'm trying to balance here two kinds of technology in the air at the same time. I have an iPad and I have a laptop. I was on a journey coming here just like Ken was. And it wasn't exactly like Ken's, and mine goes back quite a ways. Let me start from there and try to bring you up to speed as much as possible, and I'll see if the computer joins us along the way. I got exposed to Gestalt therapy as a neuropsychiatric technician in the United States Navy during the Vietnam War. There was a civilian psychologist going down to Esalen and training with Fritz Perls. I was a young, know-nothing, about 20 years old, and I got assigned to be in the Gestalt group. And that was my start with Gestalt therapy. Hold on. So, fast forward from that, and I became a Christian. I went into my first career. I became an ordained clergyman. This is something that Ken and I have in common. My theology is right, but... and when I went back to school for my doctoral program, I enrolled in a Gestalt training program because I had been exposed to it at an experiential level, and I wanted to get a good theoretical base. I wanted to know why I was doing, or might be doing, what I was doing. That is not going to happen. Okay. So, we're going to go without the slides, and I'm going to wing it here. No, take too long. It's pretty simple what I want to do. The journey that I've been on has brought me to this place through my being in the military, through my previous career in the clergy, through working with people in psychotherapy. I like working with people. That's why I went into being a psychotherapist, and that's why I like being a Gestalt therapist. So when it came time to look around and say, what's going on? Gestalt therapy seems to be being shoved aside. Oh, what's this thing called research? Well, we need to have some. And nobody was doing it. I come from the United States, and people would talk about, oh, well, we don't need research because we're kind of satisfied with what we do and why we do it. But increasingly, research was something that was needed because, as has been established, people were being disenfranchised or shoved aside because there was no research evidence base. So about 2006, started talking with a number of people, and we just realized that the Gestalt therapists were not in academia. They weren't not in academia. They weren't in university positions, at least in the United States, where they could generate a research program. So it had to be that Gestalt therapists were going to have to be the ones to generate the research. So we got together and we decided, let's write a book. Let's put a book together, at least to try and get the ball rolling as we knew it. And that became the handbook for theory, research, and practice in Gestalt therapy. So there's a number of people in that book that were in on that project. Move on from there. In my work in the Association for the Advancement of Gestalt Therapy, I often felt as if I was pushing a boulder up a hill. You know, like, let's do research, and nobody else wanted to do that. So this is a big struggle. A lot of effort to do that kind of thing. Let's stand up at the conference and try and drum up some support and hear the echo just fading away. Nobody's there. One thing led to the next, and we decided that we would put on a conference. It was called the Research Conference. It happened in 2013 at the Gestalt International Study Center at Cape Cod. And so I went there with all of this as background. We need to do research, pushing the boulder. But when I got to when I got to Cape Cod, what I found is a whole bunch of people that were very excited about research. As I've been sitting over here on the side, I've been looking out across at you wondering, are you guys excited about research? Or is it like the litter box phenomenon? Like somebody's got to do it, but I don't really want to do this. I so appreciate what has been presented so far. I appreciate what Ken brought, that there is an ethos and a value to what we do as Gestalt therapists, and that we don't want to lose that. But I've got to walk in a kind of pragmatic way. Gestalt therapy has a history in pragmatism, and we need to be practical. We just have to be practical. We have to generate some research. Why? A lot has been said about Gestalt therapy becoming disenfranchised. In other words, that Gestalt therapy as a modality would not be recognized in a certain place. In the United States, it's moving in a slightly different direction, but related direction, like this. We have something called evidence-based practice. So evidence-based practice is really something that speaks to the therapist, not just the modality that the therapist is using. So evidence-based practice is something that you and I would do. How would we do that? We would look at the best available evidence, and then we would put that together with our clinical orientation, the way that we do things, the culture, various kinds of other things like that, the client preference. There is a definition of evidence-based practice, which I had on a slide, but you didn't have it memorized. Take my word for it. But this is something that a therapist would do. You could say then, I have an evidence-based practice. Why? Because you are knowledgeable about research, and you scour the research literature, and you pull out this, and you pull out that, and you pull out this next thing, and you put together an evidence-based practice. That's not being eclectic. That, as a Gestalt therapist, what that would be is taking a little piece of, or taking this research paper, taking that research paper that related to Gestalt therapy, and saying, this is the best available practice, and I put that together, and I have an evidence-based practice. Well, this is what the APA, the American Psychological Association, wants people to do. So they're in the process of looking at the best available evidence and taking that to the best practice and generating practice guidelines for treatments that relate to certain problems. So look at this now. What's going to happen, I predict, in not too long, because I know the APA is actively working on generating these practice guidelines. I tried to get on one of the committees to put some Gestalt stuff in there, but they wouldn't let me. Anyway, so the state psychology boards, when they go to license somebody, will ask the prospective licensee, well, how would you treat this particular thing? And if that person doesn't answer according to those practice guidelines, they won't get a license. So it's not just that the modality is going to not be allowed so that people won't get paid or they won't be able to practice as a Gestalt therapist. in the United States at least, they may not be able to get a license if they identify as a Gestalt therapist. And so, to me, it's just a very practical matter. We don't want to lose our ethos, our values, and I don't believe that it's necessary. I don't think there's a real polarity between quantitative and qualitative, for instance. But we need to be able to generate credible research that produces evidence that can be pointed to and be included among the basis for these practice guidelines. That's what's needed. I'm going to ask, I'm not watching the time here, but I'm going to ask that if there's a question somewhere as I go along through here, because it's now become rather disjointed in my head, to go ahead and ask that. But there's three things that I would like to look at. One is a subject called warrant. A lot is said about evidence, but evidence by itself is an inadequate construct. Warrant, W-A-R-R-A-N-T, is a much more adequate construct. Okay, so that's one thing that I want to talk about. Then I want to talk about research which is related to a coherentist form of warrant, and I'll explain what that is. And then I want to talk about the practice of Gestalt therapy, which in this context is related to research that affects public policy, like I just mentioned. Am I speaking too fast? Okay. Warrant means justification. So, is the practice of Gestalt therapy justified? Am I justified when I say I'm a Gestalt therapist? Okay, so that's what's being asked. That's what warrant is about. And warrant is based partially in personal experience. Personal experience is one form of warrant. So what am I talking about? This is anecdotal kinds of stories. When first started talking with Gestalt people about research, they would say things like, well, I don't need research to tell me that this stuff works. I work with my clients. Let me tell you about this one. And case studies in journals are this kind of anecdotal, largely anecdotal kinds of evidence. That's one form of warrant, but it's a kind of light kind of warrant. Okay, warrant is also based partially in foundationalism. I have two brothers that are in construction. They build houses. I thought one year that I would try and fund part of my education by being an apprentice carpenter. This was in the Sacramento Valley during the summer when it gets to be about 110. I quickly found out that, well, that's not what I want to do. That was hard work. But what these guys do when they build a house is they build a foundation. They lay a foundation first, right? And then the superstructure or the rest of the house, the framing comes up from the foundation. If the foundation is off, the rest of the house is off. Another way of looking at foundationalism is that any scientific fact or any principle of philosophy that is used like this as a foundation kind of sets up a risk, because if you disprove that foundational fact or disprove that foundational philosophy, like has happened with Cartesianism, then the whole thing comes down. So it's risky, and largely what we've got with, at least in my experience, in Gestalt therapy is this kind of foundationalism from philosophy. I don't know, I belong to a listserv, and we go round and round talking philosophy. I love doing that with my friends. A lot of people on the listserv, they kind of zone out when you start doing that. But we are heavily built on continental philosophy. And it becomes a kind of foundation so that when we start talking about what we're doing, we start proving what we're doing by resorting to the foundational philosophies. And that's okay. It's a form of warrant. I just don't think it's enough, personally. And now we come to evidence. Warrant is also based partially in evidence. The problem with this is that all evidence is limited and subject to things like researcher bias, different kinds of methodologies. And we have to deal in a post-positivist. We've seen how there's a philosophy, a contrast was made between a positivism and a relativism and other kinds of things. We don't live anymore in a positivist philosophy of science. We live in a post-positivist. What does that mean? It just means that there are some holdovers to the idea of a reality, objectivity, but it's known relatively. We can make approximations of knowledge about what is. And we don't ever fully grasp, as the positivists did, a direct relationship to truth. This is from the original report of Division 12, the Society for Clinical Psychology of the American Psychological Association, on empirically validated treatments. Now, let me tell you about empirically validated treatments. When I went to Bermuda, I encountered a therapist, a psychologist who had come from another country, and she was grounded in empirically validated treatments. Which means basically that unless she had a research paper or research project that she could point to that showed a good effect for working with a particular population and a particular symptom or psychological disorder, then she couldn't do it because she had to have empirically validated support for what she was doing. She went to Bermuda. There are no psychological reports on that population. So she just could not practice. She was up a creek. So this is what, and the statement originally on empirically validated treatments came out of this Division 12. But it's interesting what they did say about it. From a research perspective, no treatment is fully validated. There are always more questions to ask, e.g. about non-specific effects or the essential components about client characterizations that might make this treatment less effective than another. To a certain extent, then, the decision on whether a particular treatment has sufficient empirical validation to warrant its dissemination for widespread clinical training and implementation will rest on the use of criteria which are somewhat arbitrary. Somewhat arbitrary. Because of the arbitrariness of drawing the line at what constitutes sufficient evidence for treatment efficacy, we have proposed two categories: well-established treatments and probably efficacious treatments. And there's actually a third category, which is experimental treatments, things that haven't been supported well enough. So what do we have to do? We have to, in this practical effort, we have to generate the kinds of evidence that these people who monitor the gate, so to speak, respect? What do they respect? What is the gold standard for this kind of research? And we're talking about outcomes research. Yes, process research, extremely important, but when we're talking about a practical benefit that we're trying to accomplish here, we really need to talk about outcomes research. And we need to get that done and the other stuff done. But the outcomes research is that practical thing. And what they were looking for is random controlled treatments, RCTs. Those are done with groups. You can't do that, really, by, individual Gestalt therapists really can't do large groups unless they're organized, like Christina's going to talk about, by associations, for instance. But usually, the individual therapist does not have access to a population that they can divide into at least 30 people here and 30 people over there, 30 people over here for the control group, 30 people over here for the treatment group. I don't have access to that. I'm not part of an academic program with students where I can run that kind of project. So it's interesting that this same group, the Society for Clinical Psychology, said, well, there is a logical alternative to RCTs, and that is the single case timed series design, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow. And hopefully the computer will work then. But what this does is it uses the one person, the one client, as the control against him or herself. And that was kind of shown in Peter's display here, where he showed a baseline. We'll talk more. I'll talk more about that. So, if, according to the people that are writing about this kind of thing, if you have between 3, 4, 5, something like that, single case design projects that show that a particular, in their outcomes, show that it's effective, then what you have is a probably efficacious treatment. If you have larger, I've read reports where it just uses these relative terms, small, large, but first one about 3 to 5, maybe up to about 10, something like that. If you've got 10 single cases, then that establishes the therapy as a, quote, well-established therapy. That's the thing that we need to have listed in the reports for the gatekeeping type of people that are going to put together the treatment guidelines, that are going to look at whether or not to accredit Gestalt therapy in a particular region. They're going to be looking at that kind of thing. You have to have RCTs or a number of single case designs. And there are a number of other things too that in a evidence-based practice that the therapist would rely on. Not just these two. These two are essential. And then all these other things too. And so any questions? Okay. So if all of these things are kind of inadequate in and of themselves for a good enough warrant, what are you going to do? Well, you have to kind of pull them all together into a web of with many touch points. So that's called a coherentist justification. It's a holistic system, field-oriented understanding of causality. It's a web of belief. Justification is a feature of a system of beliefs with multiple touch points. So we not just have multiple touch points in terms of these different kinds of warrant. See, we don't just throw out anecdotal evidence. We keep that. We don't just throw out the philosophy, we keep that. We don't just ignore that we need evidence, we keep that. And these are the multiple touch points. And beyond that, we have multiple methods of different kinds of research design. So when you have this kind of multiplicity, it forms a really solid and strong web of belief, a strong warrant. So is Gestalt therapy warranted? The larger field is stuck asking if any given intervention or approach to therapy is evidence-based, but that's inadequate. We need to be better than that, and I believe that we can. It would benefit our own field and contribute to the field of psychotherapy. This is another thing. I think that in terms of our ethos and our values, we need to be involved with these other people. When we get involved with these other people, we will affect the field, the larger field. We will move the pile, so to speak. At the research conference that's next coming up, we had one in 2013, we're going to have one in 2015. The design of that conference is to have mentors in residence, well-established, what you would call world-class researchers who will be in residence. They'll do a presentation and then they'll just hang out and talk. They'll talk with people who are doing research, didn't know about research, whatever. One of the benefits of the 2013 conference was for me to see the excitement among the people who came. That was an international conference, and out of that was generated an international research project using single case time series design. There's a fellow, Pablo Herrera Salinas in Chile, who's heading it up. Jan Rubal is heading it up in Europe. I'm an English speaking coordinator. We have a group of people working on that, which is fantastic. So we've been working on the design, ironing out the different factors involved, and we've actually applied for a grant from the American Psychological Association in connection with this project. Whether we get the grant, to me, is irrelevant. We put Gestalt therapy on the map with the APA by just applying. Research. What time am I done, Jan? Okay. In respect to this, we need to embrace multiple methods, like I said, while maintaining the philosophical perspective. We need to be, and here's something, we need to be open to adjusting our theory. When I first started talking with people, it was like, yeah, let's do research so we can prove Gestalt therapy works. And we want to kind of cram that it works into the research. But really what ought to happen is that the research ought to inform the way we do therapy. And that was kind of present, I think, in Peter's presentation. There's valuable information in that. And we can learn a lot and we can refine what we're doing as Gestalt therapists if we get more involved with research. In one article that I read about the scientific method, it said that it was like a three-legged stool. And one leg is very careful observation. And I really resonated with that as a Gestalt therapist, to use a phenomenological method, really pay attention to what's going on with the client, really observing, fine-tuning that observation, trying to be as careful with it as possible. The second leg is mathematical analysis of what you observed. And the third leg is critical evaluation or critical thinking in regard to the results. So to me, that kind of, I don't know, maybe you won't make this leap, but to me it was like science and philosophy. Critical thinking is about philosophy. So in the critical thinking, it's not just about what happened in the methodology. It's about the implications and the applications of that research. Here's something. We need to educate people not just to do research. We need to educate people so that they can understand research, so that they know where to find it, so that they can have evidence-based practice if they want, and use research to make them more effective in what they're doing. So here's some methods. And in each of these methods, there is a kind of question. In Bermuda, sometimes I'm asked to do a psychological assessment. And somebody typically will send over this request, this referral, and they'll say, please do a psychological evaluation of so-and-so. And I have to get back to them and say, what do you want to know? Because what they want to know dictates what kinds of things that I do. It's the same thing with this. What do you want to know? What you want to know is your research question, and it kind of sets up the methodology that you'd use. So clinical observation and systematic case study. I'm going to go through the different kinds of things here that make for an evidence-based practice. So clinical observation and systematic case study provide anecdotal testimony, and the question here is, what's going on? What's going on with a therapist? What's going on with a client? What's happening? Qualitative or phenomenological research provides texture, color, related, correlated facts, the raw material of theory creation. And the question here is, what's happening in this process? It's kind of like the first one, but it's more systematic. What did people do? What sense did they make of what they did? Does this set of data suggest a relationship between factors in the study? And that leads to other kinds of things. Process outcome studies provide a look at mechanisms of change. The question here is, which aspects of the process were most powerful leading to the change? Single case experimental designs, I've kind of talked about that. A look at causal factors and outcome for an individual person or group considered against itself. And that, by the way, it's not just an individual client. People who are using Gestalt principles for organizational work can do single case studies on a group, measuring the group against itself. The question here was, Gestalt therapy as practiced by therapist A, the cause of change in client B? There's a difference between an effectiveness study and an efficacy study. Effectiveness is, was there a change? Are people satisfied with a change? Did something happen? Something changed. The efficacy study says, in terms of if it was Gestalt therapy, says Gestalt therapy caused this change. And that's a higher degree of concern, I believe. Meta-analysis is an interesting thing. That's observation of patterns across multiple studies and comparison of effect sizes. You saw the effect sizes in Peter's data. They are high. You saw what his comparison to other modalities were. They're low. The other modalities are low. Gestalt therapy has, I've seen this kind of thing in other studies too, the effect sizes for Gestalt therapy are high. When I was writing a chapter on Gestalt therapy for a particular book, I put in those effect sizes, and the editor came back to me and wanted to know, is that right? Did you get that right? Yeah, I got that right. Okay. I already talked about that. This all came, the things that I've tried to share here, didn't just come out of my journey going from a neuropsych tech in the Navy to becoming involved with research. I really do view research as emptying that cat litter box. I don't want to do it. It's not my main interest. I'd rather just be a people person working as a therapist. But I understand that it's got to be done. And I'm willing to be involved in doing it. And so when I started interacting with people, I became known as a person who is involved with research. And one day Lynn Jacobs and Gary Yontef asked me to contribute to their chapter in Corsini and Wedding's latest edition, Surveys Psychotherapies, about research. So I wrote that section, and I sent it off to them. I waited. And then they got back to me and said, "Thanks very much for your help. We'll take it from here." Because they didn't agree with what I had to say. And so that prompted me to say, well, can I use the background of our conversation to write an article about this? Yes, that was fine. And that resulted in an article that's in the current issue of Gestalt Review. Come on now, let's get serious about research. Mark McConville, Todd Burley, and Leanne O'Shea responded with commentaries, and then I responded to them. I say this not to say, not to pit people against one another. We have a lot to talk about in the Gestalt community. And this issue of research is going to provoke discussions that relate to philosophy of science. You've seen or sensed perhaps some of the difference here today. That's only going to increase. We have a large ethos of social constructionism. Science and research is built on critical realism. Science and research is built on naturalism. Phenomenology is an anti-naturalist system. We've got some internal kinds of conflicts that we need to sort out. And that will only help us, I believe, to have that kind of discussion. So it's not just that people need to learn how to do research, and they need to jump in and participate in this research project or that one. It's that we all need to engage in the conversation, because that will make what we're doing a lot better. It will make what we're doing and doing research an activity that doesn't sell us down the river, that we don't lose our souls in gaining that research world. That's what I believe anyway. Okay, that's it. Any questions? I have to tell you this. In my Gestalt group, you see this? This is because of my wife. When I was in my my Gestalt training group, I decided that I was tired of fussing with hair. I was losing it anyway, so I just buzzed it off. I just got some clippers, and it's real easy, just buzzed it off. Okay, in my Gestalt training group, the trainers began to call me the Colonel because of this. That's all. But my wife always wanted to have somebody with a pigtail, so okay, we do that. And if left to myself, I would wear black socks, very drab, but no. Life is wonderful. All right, thank you very much.